conference for child sexual abuse awareness put on by Yolo County Incest Survivors Speakers Bureau. So kudos to Connie. Where is she? She's sitting over there behind the camera. Thank you very much for coming. Given it's Palm Sunday, given it's time change, we really appreciate your coming. This being our 10th, how many people have attended previous conferences? Aha, so have anyone been to all 10? Connie. How about, we got 9 people coming for 9? Oh, valid, okay. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and we have newcomers. We have newcomers here for the first time? Wow, great, okay. And our main speaker came from Massachusetts, so I don't know if we have anybody who came farther than that. I think some of our speakers was from Utah, San Diego, so I don't know about the rest of you, but I just came from Sacramento, so not too bad. I just wanted to let you know a few housekeeping details. The bathrooms are out these doors, and then there's a sliding glass door that opens automatically when you walk in, and then the restrooms are a little farther along on the right or left, farther down there. And if you feel the need, we'll take some breaks, but if you feel the need, just please take care of yourself. There's water on the table. How do you like the title of this conference, Men in Robes? Pretty catchy. Connie says we were interested in 3 issues: the pedophile priest scandal, ritual abuse by priests of deviant religions, and judges putting children in the custody of abusers. And most of all those 3 are men in robes. And for the decor this time, I used treasure chests, and rather than use money, I put little dime-sized mirror pieces around. And the idea was that you are the treasure. If you can see yourself in that little piece of mirror, most of us can't see all of ourselves and no one else can. We can't see all of anyone else and they can't see all of themselves. And ritual abuse is a part of you, but not all of you. April is Child Abuse Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We will have a celebration tonight after the conference. The conference goes till 5, and then at 6 we'll have a banquet. They ask for a donation of $15 for that. We'll have music. They're already set up back here by Eclectica, playing Brazilian music. And anyone who's helped with the conference is free for that dinner. And then on the second day of the conference, sometimes our conferences are 1 day, sometimes they're 2. The second day is tomorrow at Sierra Health Foundation, 1321 Garden Highway in Sacramento. And that costs $75. It's focused for therapists, but it's open to everyone. So we may see you there also. And if you're here for CE credits today, please make sure you sign in and out and hand in your evaluation forms, and it's $35 at the end. And Jenna, who is Connie's daughter, is out there to help set up that registration. And I just realized today that she was 12 when Connie started doing this, and she's now 22 and getting ready to graduate from college in psychology and looking into the child protection field. No surprise. Now we have Reverend Kibby Ruth, and she's going to say a few words. She's a minister from the United Church of Christ and a physicist. And she trains churches to be safe and helps churches when there are allegations of sexual and other abuse. She's founder and senior consultant of Kuros Ministry in San Mateo. And Kuros means legitimate, limited, compassionate power, benevolent, from the Greek. And she says, Kuros Ministry works to develop leadership within the religious community to create healthy power relationships within congregations to prevent misuse of power and protect those at risk of abuse. Reverend Ruth.
When Connie found out I was coming to the conference anyway, she was like, oh, you're a minister, it's Palm Sunday, do something. But the real question is, how do you invite the spirit of power and strength into a conference as a minister when every tool of every major faith tradition has been used by abusers in their efforts to destroy the souls of others. I can't light a candle, I can't read sacred texts, I can't use symbols like water, I can't pray, and so on, because those things were destroyed. So with my rage and deepest compassion and sorrow for what happened to some of you is also tremendous rage that offenders used symbols, spiritual symbols, and spiritual language, and in some cases, and their role as representatives of the divine, to destroy rather than empower. And that's downright evil. But yet, after all that trauma that some of you have been through, you are here. Here you are, defiant, strong, and healing. Each one of you is really a miracle of resilience, a victory of life over death, voicing truth where there was silence. Now somehow you survived. One of the men who works with us, who was abused by a priest, said he survived by when the abuse was happening, he would mentally have a cord that he would sort of hold on to in his mind. Because if he held on to that cord, he knew that God could still find him if he just held on to that little cord. Now, I don't know what it was for each of you or us that kept us through our childhoods holding it somehow together so that we could be here. But I invite your cord, whatever that might be or is, to be with us here today, to give us courage to listen, courage to speak, and to continue our empowering journey, and to stay awake and aware today. So be it.
Thank you, Reverend Ruth. And did Jonathan Raven get here? Deputy Attorney General, Director of Office of Victim Services. He's a former Yolo County prosecutor who prosecuted child sexual abuse cases. It says your wife is having a baby.
Had a baby.
Had a baby, so that's why he's here. And he's going to say a few words about the Office of Victim Services.
Who will speak for the children? As a prosecutor in Yolo County, I had, I guess you'd say, an opportunity to prosecute many child abuse and sexual assault cases. One in particular was a case called People versus Conley. And this man, if you could call him that, did unspeakable things to his two children. Right here in Woodland, and I drove by there yesterday on an errand, my wife and my newborn, and driving by that area where that happened out at in that trailer made me want to lose my lunch again. Well, I had the opportunity to be a voice for this child, Christopher Conley. And during this trial, as I was standing asking him questions, and he was telling 12 people who he didn't know about these terrible things that had happened to them, he and his sister, that is. Whenever I would ask children that final question where I would talk about what a good touch is and a bad touch, and I would say to them, have you ever had a bad touch? I'd almost cry right there in front of the jury or the judge. And at first I tried to stop myself, and then I realized that it was natural, and that's what the jury wants and expects. But doing that over and over again was so difficult, but yet fulfilling at the same time if I could allow these children to speak about what happened and to hopefully get some justice. And in that case, there was justice, and this man was sent away to prison for many, many years. But in that case, the justice wasn't the most fulfilling thing. What was so fulfilling was as I was standing there and that young boy was excused from the witness stand, he walked up and right in front of the jury, he gave me a big hug. And I sat there in front of the jury on my right, kind of pushing him away and pulling him at the same time, and that was just made the whole case worthwhile. Now, sometimes you don't get justice by the legal system. But I'm a firm believer that there is a higher sense of justice somewhere, whether it be through a God, through karma, through whatever. And I was teaching a class this past week in trials to students at UC Davis, and I was talking to them about what I did before my closing argument. And I would sit in my office and play a song by a rock group called AC/DC, and this song was called, this is what I would do to prepare myself for the closing argument and to get in the zone, so to speak. And that song that I would play was called Hell's Bells. And to me, I believe that if I didn't get justice through that jury, that person sitting there who had been accused and done terrible things to the children would get justice one way or another at some point in time. So who is going to speak for the children? Lois Wolk is speaking for the children. Jeannie Adams, who you'll hear later, speaks for the children. Connie Valentine, Karen Anderson, Bud and Judy Wolf, our local police, our local sheriffs, our district attorneys, and our Attorney General. Our Attorney General, Bill Lockyer, is a huge proponent of stopping child abuse and child sexual assault. And we actually had a meeting with him, with Judy and Bud Wolf and people from the Care Center at the UC Med Center this past week, and he was very encouraging, extremely encouraging. We will be having a huge national conference for victims in Sacramento. This National Organization for Victims Assistance has asked the Attorney General to be the host this next summer, and this conference goes from state to state all over the country. There'll be quite a few workshops on child sexual assault and child abuse, and I encourage all of you to attend this summer in August, and there's information at the table out there. Jeannie Adams will hopefully be speaking there also. And also, we are having a one-day conference sponsored by the Attorney General's Office of Victim Services, on April 21st. And actually, Jeannie Adams will be speaking there also. And we'll also be having the detective who investigated the Samantha Runyon abduction case coming up from Orange County. And you can contact, there's brochures out there, you can contact our office for more information. I encourage you all to attend this one-day conference, it will be great. Well, speaking of this NOVA conference, I was in Washington, D.C. for a board meeting for NOVA planning this conference. And one of the mornings I was, actually in the afternoon when I got there, I was running by Capitol Mall in D.C. And I'm used to running out here where it's obviously not very cold, and out there it was about 20 degrees when I was in shorts and a thin shirt, running by all these people in gloves and hats and earmuffs. And as I ran by them, one of them said, where are you from? And they asked me if I was from Florida, and I said, no, California. Same difference, Florida, California. But it was freezing, and I ran up to the Lincoln Memorial, and I'm here planning this victims conference. And as I ran up those steps, and I saw Lincoln right in front of me, all of a sudden, I wasn't cold anymore. And I felt what I was doing was so important. And I turned around and saw the Washington Monument the other way, and it was an incredible feeling. And then I ran by the Vietnam Wall, which is so moving. And it reminded me of a class I took when I was at UC Santa Barbara in the early 80s called Religious Impact on Vietnam. And it wasn't really a religious class, but it was a class where this professor named Professor Capps, who later became a congressman and died while in office in Santa Barbara, his wife had taken his seat, had this class where he would bring in folks from all different aspects of the Vietnam War. And this was a time when still Vietnam veterans were not really accepted, not as heroes like they were. And we had conscientious objectors and Vietnam veterans and nurses and all sorts of other people come and speak. And after every class, someone would stand up to all the veterans that were there to participate and to watch and to be involved. And someone would say to them, "Welcome home." And they would all stand up. And so at this time, what I would like to do, if you're comfortable, is ask all of you who have been touched in any way by child sexual assault or child abuse, whether it be you, your children, to stand up, please, if you could. And I want to say to all of you, welcome home. So who speaks for the children? Who's going to be their voice? And the real answer is all of you. Thank you.
Do you take questions? Real short.
Go ahead.
I understand recently, in 1981, there was a law passed in California which the children of families in an incest situation, generally, if it comes to trial at all, it's set up as a probation situation and it's not considered a felony. As of 1981, generally across the board. I don't know, and there is a new back bill coming through to make that different, to change it so that children that are in families, if they're molested by a family member, that the penalty would still be 3 to 16 years as it is outside of the family. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Well, the way the law was written, I don't know what the intent of the legislature was when it wrote that law, but that diversion or probation was an option. It's not something that had to be used. And I know actually in our office, at the DA's office here in Yolo County, our DA would not let us use that option. Okay? Sometimes that option would be used in cases that were extreme, and this is where people need to understand the big picture. Some cases are not winnable. You just can't win them. You know it happened, but you can't win them because the child's too young, because there's all sorts of other issues going on, and you can't win them at trial, but you know it happened. And so sometimes that is actually a good tool to have a hook on that person. That's better than nothing. Some people might think that is a bad thing, it should never be used. Others might think if used correctly, and that's the key, it could be a good tool. But the bottom line is, I don't think there are that many prosecutors that are letting child molesters who do serious, crimes.
The question is serious. I was told by an attorney that in the family they do very little and that generally they consider it minor unless they have proof that it's outside of the family. That was my own experience.
And in my experience, I don't think that's true. But that's not to say that doesn't happen, and it's not to say we prevent that from happening.
In my case, I went to the DA's office and I was told that by
Hi, my name is Marilyn Carvino, and I'm from Siskiyou County. I've got a case that's ready to wonderful. However, Mr. Locke here seems to be having a problem providing me with discovery. That is, our district attorney issued a complaint to the Attorney General when I'd be arrested for a felony for publishing a transcript of our district attorney's speech to the Libertarian Party this Valentine's Day. Transmitted it all over the internet. I did transcribe the speech and I did transmit it over the internet. However, Mr. Lockyer is refusing to provide me a copy of the complaint by being the defendant. Could you tell me how I could force that action?
Well, I know they're trying to move things along here. I'd be happy to talk to you. Let me give you my phone number. And anyone who wants to take my phone number can take it. It's 916-324-9945. Did you get that?
Right, I get it.
916-324-9945.
And I want to say thank you, and we're so pleased and happy that you're taking such a personal and dedicated interest in meeting more people like you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Reagan. Our next speaker will be Lois Wolf, Assemblywoman from Assembly District 8, Yolo County. The former Davis City Council member, Davis Mayor, Yolo County Board of Supervisors, now Assemblywoman, the chair of the Assembly Human Services Committee. She helped bring Yolo County agencies together to develop the multidisciplinary interview center so children who disclose abuse don't have to be interviewed repeatedly. As a result of the improved protocol, an incest perpetrator in Yolo County just got sentenced to 238 years in prison. Connie's going to present her.
Lois, I get to do these lovely presentations. So, yes, you do. Lois has been involved with this issue ever since the beginning of our conferences. We were amazed that a person who, I think you were the mayor at the time, would be interested because it's such an ugly topic. But Lois has consistently helped the children of this county. So we want to present you with the Incest Survivor Speakers Bureau Award for deep gratitude for your caring, compassion, and concern for Yolo County's abused children, and your incomparable skill in bringing our community together to protect these young residents. Lois, thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much. It is an honor. And I was saying to Connie that I can't believe it's been 10 years. Thanks for having me here again today and for putting on this conference. Not only do I need to thank Connie and Lori and others who have worked on this conference, Connie certainly has been my primary contact for the last 10 years. But Jonathan, who unfortunately left, I wanted to tell you about him. There are a lot of people that need to be thanked about the way that this issue has evolved over the last 10 years. There's quite a difference between the way it was perceived and treated 10 years ago and the way it is now. And we have a lot of people to thank for that. And one of the people is Jonathan Reagan, who as a district attorney and our district attorney, did not rest quietly on these issues, took them on and almost like a crusade, made sure that where they could prosecute, they did, and where they couldn't, they were vigilant about putting together other services that would help victims even though they couldn't prosecute successfully. I also want to thank the health professionals in the audience who were not silent on this issue from the beginning, and especially the victims who, frankly, despite their fear and concerns, bore witness to what happened to them and forced us to pay attention. So Connie, you've come a long way in 10 years. 10 years ago, this was in a much smaller venue, and I know that the night before you were probably making the refreshments as opposed to having them here for Starbucks donating, hoping you get a few attendees. But you did, and even at the third conference that I remember addressing in 1997, the recognition of the issue was still not there, but it was growing, and the conference was growing. We moved to larger headquarters here. And at this 10th conference, you've brought people from all over the country. There will be, by the end of the day, I'm certain, hundreds of participants. And there have been grants and support from all kinds of, all sources. And there's someone else I want you all to know and meet before the day is over, and that is Bud Wolf. Bud, raise your hand. Bud is a member of our local Rotary Club, but that's not enough. When Bud was president of the Rotary Club, he went to the international gathering and decided that this was an issue that needed, child abuse was an issue that needed attention. and Awareness. And he has been unstinting in his efforts to raise the awareness for child abuse throughout not only this city, this county, and this region, but throughout the entire world. And he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for that effort. Glad to thank you. Now, I know on a personal level, many of you have overcome tremendous obstacles and fears about speaking out, but I applaud your courage. It's important that we have that. Your words do have an impact. Your work in the conference, Connie, and others benefited countless individuals, information, resources on this topic, encouragement, supports to abused children, to families, to adult survivors. Thank you for your strength and your willingness to help and to pursue this issue. There are many local agencies that are involved, and this conference will bring together over the day many local agencies that provide services to children and families. I want you to pay special attention to the local MDI, and we need another name for this organization, the Multidisciplinary Interview Center. For those of you that don't know what that is, that simply means that when there is an allegation of abuse and it involves a child, that there's a place that that child can go where that child will receive professional care once, not 5 interviews with 5 different agencies, but people will be there that, one, will assist in prosecution and do it properly, and also to assist in the mental health and serious concerns that certainly a child and the family will have. I also want to draw your attention to my own legislation, 2254, which will look for a permanent source of funding for local MDIs. And in that effort, Jonathan Raven has been extremely helpful, and I'm hopeful that the Attorney General will be supportive as well. Now, you were kind enough to give me a gift, and I'm going to do something. I think when you hit, with an organization like this, when you hit an anniversary, a 10-year anniversary, you really need something special. And the legislature does do one thing extremely well, and that is present resolutions. And I like that. And yes, we do. And we don't give these out willy-nilly, no indeed. Connie, please come join me. And I'm not going to read the whole thing because it goes through the entire history, but I will just read one whereas. Somebody's. So I'm just going to read one of the whereases and the resolved. First of all, whereas the Northern California Child Sexual Abuse Awareness Conference is committed to promoting effective policies that protect children from harm, and it is appropriate at this time that its contributions to ensure children's safety and well-being be acknowledged and praised. Now therefore be it resolved by Assemblymember Wolf that I urge the public to attend this conference, and by this resolution extend my and the highest commendation of the legislature to those who play an active role in creating a healthier, safer environment for California's children. Thank you, Connie, and thank you.
Lois, we can't tell you how grateful we are for this. It's an incredible honor, and it's very beautiful, too. I'm going to have the children come up. These are hardly children, these are our young adults who have been placed originally with a parent that they did not want to go and be placed with. And as they grew up, they decided that that was not for them, and they've returned to their safe parent. So we're combining both of these issues, the issue of children who we've grown up to be survivors, and these children who rescued themselves from the lion's den, essentially. So I want to honor them and tell them how grateful we are that they are brave enough to come forward. So.
our advertised keynote speaker was David Clossy, and he was unable to attend to a family commitment. And Barbara Blaney founded SNAP, which is Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, about 15 years ago in Chicago. And David Clossy is the president, the national director of the national organization. And for a while, there were only a few chapters, maybe one in Los Angeles and San Francisco, no surprise, and St. Louis, where Mr. Clossy's from. And the speaker who came found out about a week ago, and his name is Phil Saviano, and he's from Boston. He flew in all the way from Massachusetts today. And he founded a chapter in New England in 1997. And since he did that, in about the last year and a half, there are now chapters in almost every state of the Union. Possibly not Rhode Island, he thought, and maybe not Idaho, but just about every other state. He first spoke out about the issue of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in December of 1992, revealing his childhood abuse at the hands of Massachusetts priest David Hawley that generated national headlines. And the next year, seeking access to the priest's personnel records, he and 3 other victims filed the first sexual abuse lawsuit against the Catholic Church in Massachusetts. Over a course of a 25-year career in the priesthood, Hawley had molested dozens of children, not just in Massachusetts, but in New Mexico and Texas also. After investigating Hawley's history and documenting that 6 bishops across the country had known that Hawley was a child molester, Saviano settled the suit for $12,500. However, vowing not to keep the church's secrets, he refused to the standard confidentiality provisions, very wise, very sad, designed to prevent him from further speaking about his abuse or reaching out to other victims. In May 1997, stirred by what he learned about the church and emboldened by his treasured right of free speech, he founded that New England chapter of SNAP, the Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests. Over the next few years, when it seemed that few politicians, prosecutors, or publishers cared much about clergy sexual abuse, victims from all over the Northeast turned to Phil for emotional support and guidance. Particularly in Massachusetts, it was through SNAP that many victims first found a path to healing, knowledge, and empowerment, and gained the courage to finally tell the world about their abuse. His background is in hospital public relations, and he's now the webmaster for the entire organization. He's doing some medical writing and writing a book. And a quote from the Boston Herald from October of 2002. Saviano is also what we don't see enough of in this tragic story, a true survivor, a living, inspiring example of a man who struggled to come to terms with what happened and triumphed. So, Mr. Saviano.
Now the hard part, living up to my wonderful introduction. As she mentioned, I just found out that I was coming out here a week ago. And I jumped at the opportunity not only to be able to come out to California, but also to be able to meet, hear from, and mingle with incest survivors. My whole, seems like my career in this issue has been focused entirely on clergy sexual abuse. And I've been so focused on dealing with the power of the Catholic Church, the spiritual nature of what that does to a child when the abuser is somebody who he or she considers to be God's representative on earth, that I realized that I've never had an opportunity to look at it from a perspective of an incest survivor. And in my conversation with Connie, I was talking to her about my background. And she said, well, it sounds very interesting, but on the other hand, you never had to worry about going home at night and wondering what was going to happen in the middle of the night. You never had to worry about being molested in your own bed. And that really, it hit home to me in a way that hasn't previously. I decided I'm going to talk about my experiences as a child. I'll go into the spiritual nature of things. But then I'm going to move on to my adolescence and talk about the fallout, the things that I experienced, the trust issues, the intimacy issues, the self-confidence issues. And I think those things are very similar, regardless of whether you're molested by a clergy member or by another adult. And then I'll pick up the part where I got involved again as an adult, speaking out publicly about my childhood. I got pulled into the whole ongoing saga with the Catholic Church. Talk about what brought me to form the chapter SNAP in Boston and how that ended up with the resignation of Cardinal Law that became one of the biggest national, if not international, stories in the last couple of years. I'm going to speak about an hour. There's a lot of ground to cover. I hope you'll stay with me. Unfortunately, much of what I'm going to talk about is about sex, but you'll get through it. Hopefully I'll get through it, and then I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I'd like to begin by quoting from a letter that was once sent to Ann Landers. It says, "Dear Ann Landers, I am your average, everyday child molester. I'm the guy who becomes your friend so that I can get close to your child. I prey mostly on the children of single mothers who welcome me to take the children off their hands for a while. They like the father figure I provide. The children welcome me because I act like a big kid and I take them places they enjoy. If your child is lonesome, he's the perfect child for a pedophile." I was one of those lonely kids. Meet Phil Saviano, age 11. At the time the story begins, March of 1964, I was in the 6th grade, still 2 years from puberty. I was one of 4 sons in an Italian-American Catholic family. I had 2 much older brothers who were away at school most of the year, and a younger brother who was too little for me to be his playmate. I lived in a very small Massachusetts town of about 3,500 people that was surrounded by state forests. It was a beautiful place. There was a river that flowed through the town. There were lots of places for hiking and camping. And in that river, it was clean enough to swim in. Every summer, I spent hours wearing my mask and snorkel, following the current downstream, chasing trout, pickerels, and turtles. In other words, it could have been an idyllic childhood. That March of 1964, however, a new assistant pastor arrived at my church, St. Denis Parish. His name was Father David Hawley. He was 34 years old, a big hefty guy, about 6'2", with dark hair, glasses, and a charming personality. As it was for generations, a new priest came to town, and he gained immediate respectability in that community. He was given access to kids, especially the altar boys, and also through counseling families and hearing confessions. He was in a unique position to learn which children came from stable, loving families and which ones were vulnerable. And because he wore that black outfit with the white collar, and sometimes that long black robe, with the buttons going down the front, no one ever asked or even wondered about his romantic or his sexual life. Everyone assumed he was celibate. What a great setup for a child molester. Of course, we kids didn't think about any of that. All we saw was this friendly but powerful guy who we considered to be God's representative on earth. And look at what he could do. He had the ability to forgive sins. He had the power to perform miracles, like changing the wine into the blood of Christ at Mass. He was the key person at the most important family functions, performing the baptisms, the weddings, the funerals. Yet from the first day we met him, we knew that Father Holly was different. He was approachable. He had a playful sense of humor, and the dumb things that we kids thought were funny, he laughed at too. On a certain level, he was not really an adult, but he was one of us. Within a few weeks of his arrival, he zeroed in on both me and my best friends. In the afternoons after school, I was a newspaper boy, and I stopped at the rectory every day to drop off the paper. My best friend was an altar boy, and he often helped out with Mass the first thing in the morning. So that priest had lots of opportunities to be in contact with both of us. One day after the Saturday morning religious education class, he asked us to stay behind and help him move some boxes from the church to the rectory. We were happy to do it, and he sweetened the deal by giving us 50 cents each for our efforts. Now, this was, here I'm going to date myself, this was in the time where you could buy an ice cream cone for only 10 cents. So 50 cents is quite a reward. And the next week, we did it again. He was easy to talk to. He asked about our families, our other friends, about school. We thought we were so lucky that this priest was taking such an interest in us kids. We could always count on Father Holly for a funny story or a riddle, and we soon discovered that he knew a lot of cool card tricks too. Then one day he showed up with a new deck of cards. He pulled them out of his pocket, and we saw that they had black and white pictures of naked women on them. Well, of course we thought it was strange that a priest would have cards like this, but did we want to take a look? Sure. He was letting us in on a secret. And so instead of telling our parents about the priest's porno playing cards, we just continued to feel special. We were too young to realize that one secret leads to another. And when you first start down that path, it's hard to predict where it's going to end. A couple weeks later, he had a different deck of cards, this time with color pictures of both naked men and women together. We looked at the cards, we started talking about sex. What did he know, he asked. What did we want to know? Soon after that came the day when, standing in the vestibule, which is the main entrance to the church, he unzipped his fly and exposed himself to us. The thing about the way that Father Holly operated is that he drew us in very gradually. At first, we had no idea where we were heading. But looking back, I can see that each week we took another small step towards trouble. I don't remember all the steps in the transition. One day he exposed himself to us in the vestibule. Sometime after that, I found myself performing oral sex on him in the hallway outside the sacristy, while parishioners were kneeling at the Stations of the Cross, just beyond the door. For over a year, he cornered me every chance he got, both in the church and in the rectory. There are a lot of details I do remember, even today. The coolness of that dark church basement, the smell of his sickly, sweet cologne, the beads of sweat on his forehead, the force of his hands around my skinny wrist, the sense of being completely trapped as he pushed his penis into my mouth. That church, which should have been the safest place in the world for me, even safer than my own home, became a dark, foreboding place, like that Norman Bates house on the hill in the movie Psycho. People drove by on the street without the slightest idea of the heartless and shocking activities that were going on inside. There are different instances of abuse, different places, but they all had this in common. I didn't want to be there, and he wouldn't let me leave. After several encounters with him, I realized there was no point in trying to change his mind. I learned that the sooner that I did what he wanted, the quicker I could get out of there. Here's an example of what I had to contend with. This one incident took place on a summer afternoon, down in the church basement. Father Holly sat on a gray steel chair with his black pants around his ankles, wanting me to give him a head. Now, I'll tell you, I found the oral sex to be both repulsive and nauseating, and it really broke my spirit to have to do that. I offered him every excuse I could think of. I was going to be late to supper, I had to get back to my paper route, I had to do my homework, whatever. He wouldn't let me go. Every time I stepped back, he grabbed me tighter and pulled me closer to him. If it had been someone else, a teacher, one of the customers on my paper route, I don't think I would have given in. I was not a shy kid, but when it came to power, I was no match for a priest. I just didn't have it in me to scream at him, "No, I won't do it." Now that particular afternoon, I could hear the groundskeeper outside, up on street level. He was trimming the shrubs that grew along the side of the building. This presented a dilemma for me, a conflict that I faced again and again that year. On the one hand, I kept hoping that the workmen would get close enough to the window to peer in and see what was going on down in the basement. And on the other hand, I dreaded the shame of getting caught. That was my big conflict. I wanted it to stop, but I couldn't bear the thought of somebody knowing what I was doing with that priest. As the year went on, my friend the altar boy and I discussed the Holly dilemma frequently. Neither of us could figure out how to put a stop to it. Going to our parents for help didn't seem like a good idea. First of all, the priest was so well respected. Who would believe us? Second, this was very humiliating stuff for any 12-year-old boy to talk about. And in my case, my father was a very angry guy, and I was convinced that I'd get blamed and punished for this. And if he didn't blame me, I figured he'd be so angry at that priest, he'd go down to the rectory and punch his lights out. But I'd still be in the middle. All of my customers would find out what had been happening to the newspaper boy, and I couldn't bear the embarrassment. So I kept my mouth shut. My silence did take a toll. Besides what it was doing to me emotionally, my encounters with Father Holly had a rather profound effect on my spiritual life. The fact that he was the community's moral and spiritual leader was very confusing to me. Sure, I didn't want to cooperate, but how could I disobey God's emissary on earth? And I worried greatly that year about the concept of sin and forgiveness. Where did this fall within the Ten Commandments, I asked myself. And what would be the greater sin? Yelling at a priest? Kicking him? Perhaps in an effort to get away? Or was it worse to give in to his demands and perform the sex? Well, you know what I did. Like a good Catholic boy, I obeyed. And then I went to confession. The problem with that was that my abuser was also my confessor. And for a 12-year-old kid, that was quite a dilemma. How could I bring it up in confession without inferring that he too was a sinner. And what would he say? Would he be angry with me? And yet, if I didn't confess it, would I risk going to hell? Here's how I solved it. I went into that booth, I knelt before the screen, and I recited my sins. Whatever they were, I said. I yelled at my mother, or perhaps I hit my little brother. And then I said, and you know the rest. Never once did he ask for an explanation. Just gave me my penance and set me off to kneel at the altar and pray. But I kept wondering over and over, how could he forgive my sins if he was in sin himself? Thus began the doubting, and thus began my crisis of faith at an age when I had neither the knowledge nor the maturity to handle it. As I proceeded through adolescence, I discarded most of the church's teachings. Like so many other clergy abuse victims, I became a spiritual drifter, never landing back at shore. All my life, I've seen people gain peace, strength, fulfillment in the rituals of the Catholic Church. There have certainly been times in my life where I could have used some faith to lean on, but I can't imagine what that would be like. In September of 1965, 18 months after he had arrived, Father Hawley was suddenly gone. None of us kids knew why or where he went to. But the abuse was over. The big secret, however, continued. Many abused people will say that the actual physical encounter was not the worst part of the abuse. The physical touch only happened periodically, perhaps in a limited number of situations. But the powerful secret, the knowledge of the abuse, is with the person all the time, everywhere he goes. That once outgoing and trusting boy begins to view the world as dangerous and unpredictable. He starts to doubt his own instincts and his judgment of other people, especially authority figures. One victim said to me several years ago, after I was molested by that priest, my whole outlook changed. I thought, if a man of God could do something like that to me, then anything's possible. While being abused, the victim also learns that what he does, what he wants, and how badly he feels makes very little difference to his abuser. Even after the abuse stops, he continues to think of himself as powerless or worthless. One of the difficult aspects of recovery is confronting the ways the survivor continues to set himself up for further abuse later in life. Oftentimes, he'll take what he learned as a child and carry it into his adult life. Now, you folks more than anybody, I'm sure, know that much has been written about the after effects of sexual abuse. They're frequently lifelong. They affect the person physically, emotionally, spiritually. You know what they are: depression, low self-esteem, the damaged goods syndrome that I can relate to, certainly. Inability to trust other people, perhaps. Inability to sustain intimacy in relationships. Overachievement, underachievement, substance abuse. So, you folks don't know me, but I would imagine you may be wondering, well, what happened to me? What happened to this guy from Boston? What were the after effects in his life? Well, I can't tell you all of my secrets, but I will say that through my 20s and my 30s, I had a lot of problems. What's interesting is that while I always remembered my abuse with Father Hawley, it never occurred to me that any my emotional problems were related to my childhood. For most of my life, I was quite clueless about this connection. Here's the condensed version. I went from being a carefree, outgoing, and trusting kid to a teenager who was emotionally shut down. I was painfully insecure, had great difficulty making friends in high school. I didn't date. I always felt like an outsider. In my senior year, I was depressed and lonely enough that I attempted suicide with a razor blade. Fortunately, I was not quite disturbed enough to pull that off. But I do have a small scar on my wrist to forever remind me of that painful year. What saved me, though, sort of, was that I went away to school. University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I chose a very tough science major, and I learned how to be a workaholic, going to classes and also holding a part-time job to pay for it all. I didn't drink much and I didn't do drugs because I always worried about my emotional stability. Instead, I escaped into my schoolwork. That was my excuse for being a loner. I had a few girlfriends. I lost my virginity, but I didn't really connect with any of them. And then finally, in my senior year, I had a big crisis. I realized that I was more interested in men than women. I came to this knowledge the hard way. I became friends with a new guy who moved into the dorm, and I fell in love. I developed such an intense, surprising attachment to this guy that there was no denying what it was. Unfortunately, he was straight, and so it was a very painful situation for me. I was devastated to think that I was gay, and heartbroken that my feelings for this dorm mate would never come to any good. Over the next few months, in trying to sort things out, I discovered something else. I was terrified of exploring this gay side of my personality. And here's where I think it doesn't matter whether we're talking about straight people or gay people or men or women or incest survivors and clergy abuse survivors. When you hit adolescence and you try sorting these things out, a lot of the issues are the same. The things that trip you up, I believe, are the same. If a guy expressed an interest in me, I'd get very anxious. It wasn't a compliment. I took it as a threat. I had no idea what the problem was, but I was determined to get over it. So I focused on finding a way to go to bed with the guy and let him wrap his arms around me, just to see if I could get through the experience without freaking out. I knew of a couple of bars in the Amherst area where gay men went, and I was so anxious about going there. I knew that wouldn't work. I figured I'd walk in the bar, flip out, and end up running back to the dorm. So I needed to put myself in a situation where I'd be too far away to head home. I decided to go into Boston, 3 hours away, and strand myself there at midnight. I'd be all out of money. I wouldn't have any place to stay. I'd have to go to a bar and pick somebody up. Pretty twisted, eh? So I hitchhiked into the city. I had dinner. I went to a movie. I saw Lucille Ball starring in Mame. Then at 10 o'clock, with just a few dollars left in my pocket, I stepped into this very notorious bar called The Other Side, located in a seedy part of Boston called the Combat Zone. I was very anxious, just flying by the seat of my pants. But there was no turning back. I went up to the bar, took a seat, and ordered the beer. And that's where I stayed for the next 3 hours. Just about the only person I had the courage to speak to was the bartender, a good-looking guy in his early 30s. I let him know that I had come in from Amherst and was looking for a place to spend the night. He said, "Well, you can stay with me, but I'm here till the bar closes." I felt relieved. The hours went by, he passed me a couple of beers, and I thought, how tough can this be? Well, I got much more than I bargained for. The guy took me home, and as he unfolded the couch into a bed, I realized that I had absolutely no idea how to handle myself in a sexual situation. I didn't know how to establish boundaries, how to communicate my feelings, how to demand respect for myself. I went right back to when I was 12 years old, with Father Hawley forcing himself on me, and I didn't have the nerve to shout no. The bartender anally raped me. I don't know what was worse, the physical pain, which was significant, or the disappointment that something like that would happen to me. But that was not the end of the ordeal. I assumed we were in the apartment alone, but after he finished with me, suddenly another guy came out of the bedroom. He raped me too. Thus began my life as a gay man. It took me many more years to get over my anxiety about walking into a gay bar. This past year, as I've thought a lot about my adolescent experiences, I've wondered how my life would have been different if I had gotten some therapy while I was in college. I didn't. And so I was left to sort things out on my own for another 14 years. I went on to graduate school, got a master's degree in communications, and settled into a career doing hospital and public relations. I worked through some of my issues regarding sex, had a relationship with a young guy in Boston that lasted nearly 4 years. After we broke up, I dated a few more guys, and then a couple more after that. And then in 1984, at the age of 32, I found out that I was infected with AIDS. I spent the next several years trying to be philosophical about it, while the virus slowly destroyed my immune system. It was because of my illness, however, that I did finally get into therapy. I managed to work until November 1991, but when I finally got sick, it hit pretty hard. By the spring of '92, the year I turned 40, I was planning my funeral, making out a will. I had already lost 30 pounds, and had had AIDS-related pneumonia twice. I also had a serious GI infection that caused unremitting diarrhea. The pathogen called cryptosporidiosis was working its way through my gallbladder up into my liver, where it would likely prove fatal. To complicate things further, I was having trouble keeping calcium in my system. This was causing cramps in my hands, cramps in my legs, cramps in my feet. My doctor said that when I started getting cramps in my heart, too, that my worries would be over. It was while I was struggling to stay alive that the story of Massachusetts priest James Porter first hit the news. Over the course of a few months, several dozen victims had come forward to say that they had been molested by this priest. It became a big national story, but made a lot of people very uncomfortable. I remember during one of the TV news broadcasts in Boston, the reporter broke down in tears on camera, covering the story. Then Cardinal Law launched a counterattack, calling down the power of God on the news media, particularly the Boston Globe, he said, for making such a big deal about what he said was an isolated incident. I remember lying on the couch with an IV line running out of my arm, thinking to myself, well, how isolated was it? The same thing had happened to me during the same period of time with a different priest. I didn't go any further with it, though. I was way too sick and weak. Besides that, my family was in enough pain over my illness. They didn't need to know that I had also been molested by a priest. Then something quite remarkable happened. Now, being pragmatic as I was, not wanting to go through the dismal end stages of the disease, if there was another option, I had convinced both my AIDS doctor and my psychiatrist to let me have a bottle of Saviano sleeping pills. I wanted to have the option of doing myself in if it looked like I was becoming too feeble to make decisions for myself. And I was so sick at that point that both of these physicians thought this was a reasonable request. My AIDS doc, however, agreed only on one condition, and that was if I would do something for him. He wanted me to go back on the AIDS drug, AZT. Now, in 1992, there were only a few AIDS drugs on the market, and none of them were effective for very long. I had been on AZT previously, and it had made me very anemic, just wiped me out, and I had to drop it after only 6 weeks. But he wanted me to try it again, this time at a lower dose. He hoped that I would see perhaps a modest benefit before the side effects kicked in. I was not optimistic, but I agreed just to get my hands on those sleeping pills. Well, I went back on the AZT, and guess what happened? I started to get better. Within a week, I was having less diarrhea. And then soon my lungs were clearer, my energy level improved, my appetite returned. I started eating voraciously and putting on weight. The phoenix was rising from the ashes. This was a stunning turnaround and a huge surprise to everybody. My father believed that all those offerings he had sent to the Society of St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless cases, had finally paid off. I held on to my health right through the end of the year and started making plans for a Christmas I thought I'd never see. So, are you still with me? The plot is about to thicken. On the morning of December 17th, I sat down with the Boston Globe and a cup of coffee, checking out the ads because I was planning to go Christmas shopping. As I was turning the pages, I came upon a story about a couple of guys in New Mexico who told a tale of sexual abuse out there in the 1970s by a priest who had once served in Massachusetts. I saw the name Father Hawley and I gasped as if my heart had skipped a beat. Suddenly, I knew. No one had ever stopped that guy. He had had a very long career, and after leaving Massachusetts, he molested kids in New Mexico and Texas during the 1970s and the 1980s, and was then living in Denver. This was my big, life-changing moment, seeing that newspaper story. I decided to contact one of the guys in the story to find out what had happened to him. But to do so, I had to go through the reporter, Steve Kirkchin. I didn't know it at the time, but Kirkchin was one of the Boston Globe's top investigative reporters, a real shark. And once he got me on the line, he knew he was onto a bigger story. I became his best friend. I spoke to the guy out west who told me a really sad tale of what had happened to him with Holly when this guy was only 8 years old. It made me very angry. And I realized that it was important for people to know that the problem with this priest began in Massachusetts in the 1960s, not Texas or New Mexico in the 70s or the 80s. Later that day, another victim from out west called me and encouraged me to go public. He said something I'll never forget. It's not often, he said, that someone is given an opportunity to take a stand and really make a difference in the world. Well, if I had been a healthy guy at that point, if I had been a guy with a terrific career, if I'd had a wife and kids to worry about, I do not know that I would have had the courage to go forward and speak publicly. But the truth was, I was on my own and I was living on borrowed time. The illness had destroyed my career, wiped out my finances, ruined my reputation in the eyes of some people. I really had nothing left to lose. Speaking publicly about my abuse couldn't be any harder than what I had already gone through. So I called my 3 brothers and I told them for the first time what had happened to me. I checked in with my therapist, who was supportive and I think rather proud of my decision. And then I sat down with the Globe and told Steve Kirchen my story. I did not tell him that I was an AIDS patient. And I had put on enough weight at that point that I was able to pass for being healthy. I also asked that he not print my name in the paper until other victims came forward. I felt that if my name got out there and then I was identified as a gay man who was dying of AIDS, the church would turn the illness against me and attack my credibility. And I worried that that would intimidate other possible victims from coming forward. The last person I told, the evening before the story came out, was my father. Now, I had been afraid to tell him when I was a kid, and 30 years later I was still dreading it. He had been devoted to the church his entire life. So when I told him the story, he was very angry. But not at Father Holly. When he realized that it was going to be in the newspaper, he raked me over the coals and accused me of bringing a scandal to my hometown. He just couldn't understand why I would want to go public with such a tale. Well, on Monday morning, the story ran on the front page of the Boston Globe, which was a very big deal back in those days. It was picked up by papers in the other 3 states that Holly had served. And then by January, 3 more people had come forward in Massachusetts, and over 40 people came forward in Texas and New Mexico. In late January, Father Holly was indicted in New Mexico. And 4 days later, on February 1st, 1993, the Father Holly story, with a photo of me standing outside the church in my hometown, ran on the front page of USA Today. Despite many victims coming forward, the response of the Worcester Diocese, which was this priest's home diocese in Massachusetts, was that they never had any problems with him. Through an attorney, we tried to negotiate with the diocese and asked them to at least set up a therapy fund for the victims. They refused. Now, during these weeks, I spent many hours at the library, searching through newspapers and microfilm to find out about other abuse cases in other parts of the country. I mean, I was part of this big story, and I figured I better find out what I'm involved with. Just what are the dimensions of the problem here. And I found out that there were quite a few cases, especially in places like Chicago, Washington, D.C., and Louisiana. It had never, ever occurred to me that so many priests were child molesters. I know all of my life to that point, to the age of 40, I just figured, well, I just had a very bizarre experience with this one priest. But suddenly it seemed to me like I had stumbled upon some sort of a huge conspiracy. And I had a decision to make. Was I going to accept the word of the Worcester Diocese that they knew nothing about his problems and let the matter drop? Or was I going to challenge them? The only way to get the truth was to get access to his personnel file. And the only way to do that was to file a lawsuit. So I joined with 3 other Hawley victims, and we filed the suit in early May of 1993. At the time, it was the first sexual abuse suit against the Catholic Church in Massachusetts, but it was quickly followed by several others because the Hawley story, and indeed the Porter story as well, seemed to open the floodgates. Victims of other priests in the Worcester Diocese came forward with their own stories. And a similar thing happened in New Mexico. In June of 1993, Hawley became the first of those Mexico priests to face a judge. He pleaded guilty to molesting 8 children. The judge, I think, seeking to make an example of him, sentenced him to the longest possible sentence, which in Hawley's case was a staggering 275 years in prison, which remains the longest jail term ever given to a Catholic priest in this country. I went into the lawsuit wanting to know who knew what, when, about his crimes. His behavior in the early 60s was so bizarre. He took so many chances of getting caught that I couldn't believe that he was never reported. So eventually I did get access to those personnel records, and what I learned was just amazing. Over the course of his career, as you heard in my introduction, 6 bishops in 4 states knew that he was a child molester. He was caught repeatedly. He was sent to church-run psychological treatment centers, which were not mandated reporters, repeatedly. Always brought back and given another chance. Instead of removing him from the priesthood or reporting him to civil authorities, the bishops would send him to a new community where his past reputation wasn't known. And they never once warned the parishioners to keep an eye on their kids. Among those who protected him was Bishop Joseph Fiorenza of Texas, who in the mid-1990s rose in power to become president of the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops. The thing I kept wondering over and over was this: if the bishops went to such extremes to protect Father Hawley, well, who else were they protecting? I pursued the lawsuit for a couple of years, learning everything I could. And at times it also served as an escape for me, a great diversion from my health problems and the challenge of keeping a roof over my head when I was barely strong enough to work. But when you file a lawsuit, you eventually do have to either go to trial or settle it out of court. And my lawyer strongly advised me not to go to trial because the one key element that I needed, which was proof that the bishop knew this guy was a molester, before he got his hands on me, I didn't have. See, I knew this priest very early in his career, only his 2nd assignment. And while there was lots of evidence that he was reported later on in his career, I didn't have that very early notification. So by the summer of '95, I had pushed the case as far as I could go. But more importantly, I was once again very, very sick. The leading killer of AIDS patients in those years was pneumocystis pneumonia. I had already had it twice in 1992, but in August of '95, I developed it again and was hospitalized. I was allergic to the most effective drug to treat PCP, and my doctors had to use less effective drugs with more serious side effects to bring it under control. Fortunately, they were able to do that, but the drugs left me with permanent scarring on my kidneys. And still, it was just a temporary reprieve, because unless they could figure out a way to boost or rebuild my immune system, the pneumonia was going to keep coming back. So after I was discharged from the hospital, I finally agreed to settle the case, and I told my lawyer to draw up the papers. But I said I wouldn't agree to any form of confidentiality agreement. At that point, I knew too much about how the church was operating. And for as long as I was alive, I wasn't going to be keeping the church's big secret for them. I got the document in the mail, and to my surprise, it was the exact opposite of what I had agreed to. Not only was the Worcester Diocese seeking to prevent me from discussing the specifics of my own case, my own childhood experiences, they wanted to prevent me from discussing anything that was at all related to the issue of priests molesting children. Couldn't talk to the news media, couldn't talk with my friends, I couldn't share my experiences in a support group. The only person I could speak with was my therapist, but only if she agreed to similar terms of confidentiality. Which, I was, listen, I was sick, but I was not crazy. I knew too much about the way the church operated, and there's no way I was going to be part of that conspiracy of silence. Plus, I'd had enough good therapy at this point that I knew that bottling it all up again was not going to be good for me emotionally. And I really resented the diocese for expecting me to do that. So I got my lawyer on the phone, and he insisted, of course, that this was standard policy, nothing to be concerned about. He said, everybody signs these things. In fact, the other 3 victims who had joined me early on in the lawsuit had already accepted and signed it. No questions asked. That's the way it was in those days. Everyone was keeping the secret. Victims, lawyers on both sides, even the judges. My attorney did agree to contact the lawyer for the diocese and see if there was any flexibility in the terms. They wrote back saying, we made it very clear at the time we made our efforts, we made it very clear at the time we made our offers of settlement that confidentiality provisions were an absolute requirement. So we wrote again, and again he responded, with all due respect to your client, there is absolutely no possibility that I will agree to what your client has requested. Well, on October 25th, an AP story ran in the Boston Globe. This is the time that I'm struggling with this confidentiality thing, trying to figure out what do I do? And so here's a story in the Globe, page 1, headline reads, Catholic bishops assail sex abuse of children. It seemed that the bishops were issuing a forceful pastoral message that condemned the sexual abuse of children, including abuse by clergy. In a statement titled, Walk in the Light, a pastoral response to child sexual abuse, the bishop said, the church should offer physical safety and help to survivors of abuse and raise awareness of the issue in homilies and religious education programs for parents and children. We emphasize that the community needs to call the abuser to accountability, the bishop said. We need to say, abusive behavior is wrong and we will hold you accountable for it. Well, I was a little peeved. Here they were promoting a message about accountability, yet behind the scenes, at least in Massachusetts, they were doing everything they could to avoid accountability. But what really angered me was the quote from Dolores Lecky, who was one of the bishop's spokespersons. She said they decided that child sexual abuse thrives on silence, and that their voices were needed to pierce the victim's isolation. You've got to bring things to light. That's the gospel, isn't it? She said. Well, if that was the case, I thought, why the hell were they trying so hard to silence me? But here was my, there was a, I've never referred to him as this, but there was a quote from the guy who turned out to be my savior in this story. A quote from a guy named David Colossi, who was supposed to be here today. Director of the Survivors Network for Those Abused by Priests, or SNAP. He said, it's refreshing to hear some degree of remorse on the part of the church. They've been so heavily steeped in denial that any time they address the issue, it's a step forward. Well, I decided to track David down in St. Louis and get some advice from him about this confidentiality statement. And he, in turn, put me in contact with a lawyer in New Jersey who had handled lawsuits against the church from all around the country. This lawyer called me back, and after reading the agreement, said that it was the most restrictive confidentiality agreement he had ever seen, and that the Worcester Diocese was clearly doing whatever it could to intimidate and silence me. That expert opinion was all I needed. I called my lawyer and I said I wasn't going to sign it under any circumstances. If he wanted to resign from my case, that was fine with me. Then Colossi and I decided it was time to get in contact again with my old friend at the Boston Globe, the reporter, Steve Kirchen. Finally, I told him the rest of the story, that I was gay, that I was dying of AIDS, that I was determined not to take the church's secrets to my grave, and that I was willing to go on the record about the Worcester Diocese's efforts to silence abuse victims. Well, the story came out on November 18th, 1995, with the headline, "He Refuses to Be Silenced." It was highly complimentary, but also a bit embarrassing because it did go into detail about my illness, my sexuality, and the fact that I was $7,000 in debt. And it also included a quote from my father, who had said to me in one of our recent arguments, "You got one foot in the grave, the other on a banana peel. I can't imagine why you're doing this." I got calls from a number of supporters, though. One of them was a priest in the Boston Archdiocese, who said to me, "Many of us priests think you're doing the right thing, but we can't support you in any public way because we would be reprimanded by our bishops." Well, that fall was a turning point for me in another very important way. 3 weeks later, in December of 1995, I got access to the first of a new type of AIDS drug called a protease inhibitor. It turned out to be the magic bullet and the miracle drug that to this day keeps me healthy and smiling. In April of 1996, for reasons that remain a mystery to me, the Worcester Diocese decided to drop all of its confidentiality requirements. And I agreed to settle the case for $12,500. After my lawyer got his cut, I was left with $5,400. Not a lot of money, but I achieved what I had set out to do, which was to learn the truth about this priest. I don't know why the diocese left me free to talk. Perhaps they thought I would be dead in a matter of months, not really worth the trouble, worth the fight. Maybe they worried that I would be crazy enough to actually take this to court, and they figured a settlement was better than the publicity of the trial. I don't know. One thing is for sure, retaining my constitutional right of free speech was a great victory for me. My father hoped that that would mark the end of my involvement. Ever since I went public back in 1992, we had fought and disagreed and given each other the silent treatment over this. When I settled the suit, he made it very clear he didn't want me talking to other victims anymore. And he was sick of seeing my name in the newspaper. Well, I thought long and hard about what he said. And then the next year, I decided to establish the New England chapter of SNAP. You see, the first victims of Father John Gagan, the notorious and now deceased Boston priest, were coming forward. And in their TV interviews, I was reminded of how lonely and anxious I was when I first went public. I thought to myself, boy, I could help these guys. If we had a local chapter of SNAP, I could reach out to them the way David Klossig had once reached out to me. We could compare notes. We could build a network. We might even get some legislation passed. I had the knowledge, I had the freedom to talk, and thanks to the new drugs, I had the energy to take on another project. So in April of 1997, we had our first SNAP meeting near Boston. I let the TV cameras in for the first meeting, and I soon started hearing from victims all across New England. There's a tremendous need for victims to be able to connect with other victims. Talk about what happened to them as kids. Talk about how it had affected their lives. For years, I got calls from complete strangers. After seeing me on TV or reading a quote in the newspaper, they decided to share with me secrets that they had kept to themselves for decades. I'd pick up the phone, and there'd be a man or a woman on the other end of the line, very nervous, often in tears. He or she would start by saying, "It's taken me 30 years to make this call." I became a repository of horror stories, as you can imagine. But by listening to them and sharing some of my own experiences, I set a lot of people on the road to recovery. It's hard for victims to take that first step, but those that do find it tremendously liberating to finally break the silence. Many of them continued the journey, came to SNAP meetings, and eventually reached out and provided support to newcomers the way I had originally supported them. So in the summer of 2001, when the Boston Globe Spotlight team called me to see if I could shed any light on their investigation into the Boston Archdiocese and cardinal law, I had names of a couple dozen priests to give them. I had a box of documents. I had victims who were willing to sit for interviews. Since then, thanks to survivors who joined together, supported each other, found the courage to speak up for themselves, the secrets have come out. In Worcester, over 20 priests now have either been sent to prison or named defendants in sexual abuse lawsuits. In the Boston Archdiocese, our Attorney General has tallied a staggering 240 child molesting priests. The movement of survivors speaking the truth is spread across the country, with SNAP chapters in nearly all 50 states, including one here in Sacramento run by Nancy Sloan, our San Francisco chapter run by Bill Pezel, and our Northwest Regional Office run by Terry Light. Even people who never wanted to hear the truth are finally listening. 6 weeks after the Globe began its reporting, I called my father to wish him a happy 83rd birthday. I hadn't spoken to him for a couple of months, and I was dreading the call. As the local leader of SNAP, I had been in the news again, local, national, now even international. And I figured that by making that call, I was setting myself up for another lecture and another disappointment. Imagine my surprise when, with no prompting from me, he started talking about all the problems in the church, and the secrets and the lies, and all those priests having a good time for themselves, and the bishops letting them get away with it. I was just stunned. 6 weeks of news coverage had accomplished what I had been unable to do for 9 years. He admitted to me that I had been right all along. And then he delivered this inspiring message. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Give him hell." Thank you very much. You know, coming out in the plane yesterday, I was going over that talk over and over again, and I found that there were parts of it that even after all these years, and even though I'm the guy that lived the story, was still enough to bring tears to my eyes. But I think it's a great example sometimes of how something good can come from an awful experience. And also that it's a great example of how if you just find a way to hang in there long enough, that eventually you'll see a brighter day. I appreciate the opportunity to come out and talk to you about my own experiences. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference and hearing about what you folks have learned. And I plan to be around both today and part of tomorrow as well. I don't know how we're doing for time. As you can see, I'm having a lot of trouble with my voice. I've been fighting a really bad cold, which is unfortunate timing. But if you have any questions about SNAP, the clergy abuse issue, my own history, feel free to ask them either now or corner me privately if you want, because, you know, I have no secrets. Yes?
I was wondering if through, because many of our experiences in ritualistic abuse, there's a big iceberg under the water called ritualistic abuse, and then one thing that pops up is child sex rings, another is pornography, another is clergy abuse. If any of the clergy abuse survivors that you've been working with have also had any kind of indication that they might have been part of something larger than just that particular incident?
Well, you know, the issue has come up a few times. Once in a rather personal way, there's a woman who I've become quite close with. She heads one of the chapters in another part of the country. And she had that experience as a young girl. But the other way it comes up is through a lot of sort of rumors that I hear of, you know, sort of networks and kids sort of being passed around. And it's something that nobody thus far seems to be able to really sort of nail down and expose exactly what it's all about. And so that's all I know. I don't have any other first-hand knowledge of that. Hi.
I have a question. First of all, it was incredible stories you told us and shared with us. Thank you for that. I am curious, however, about the reaction, since you shared the reaction of your father. I'm curious about the reaction of your mother and your siblings. You have many of them.
Yeah. You know, I realized that there were no references to my mother, but that was because my mother died in 1976. She never knew that I was a victim of child molestation. Although, gosh, I have often wondered how she would have reacted, and if she would have been able to help my father see the light at an earlier stage in his development. As for my siblings, you know, they were very supportive of my efforts. I think that, you know, in the early days, I think that it was hard for them to understand what was driving me. I think that they just thought that, you know, it was just one crazy priest. What's the big deal? But what did it for me? You know, I was so intrigued that he could be a priest for so long and molest so many children without him ever being pulled out of service. And I felt that, you know, there's a big mystery here. And so I was sort of fueled by the pursuit of the mystery. But then once I got my hands on these documents, and I have the letters at home, signed by all these bishops over like 25 years. And I thought that was so amazing. And it was really an indication of a much bigger problem. And that's also, I think, what turned the tide in Boston, because we had, you know, after Porter and Hawley, then there were a few other priests during the mid to late 90s who were reported on. People it never occurred to people that the bishops were in on the cover-up. Once Cardinal Law's signatures started showing up on all these documents in connection with the Father Gagan case, and people realized that he knew that John Gagan was the child molester from the mid-1980s, then it took on a whole different dimension. And that's when finally Catholics sort of perked up their ears and said, geez, maybe we should take a look at this. Yes?
Yes, two questions. Are you still a member of the Catholic Church? And also,
No.
how did this whole thing affect your belief in a God, relationship to a higher power, spirituality?
Well, I'm on that rowboat, you know, drifting. Listen, I'm not going to pull any punches here about the Catholic Church. I am not only a clergy abuse victim, I'm also a gay man, I'm an AIDS patient. And I come from a state now. There's been very, very vocal opposition about the legitimacy of any sort of gay romantic relationships in Massachusetts in the last couple of months, and the bishops are leading the charge. And so it's very hard for me to be objective about the Catholic Church. I will say that knowing what I know about the abuse problem, knowing what I know about how many bishops have protected these child molesters, believing as I do that a lot of their attitudes towards sex and sexuality, I believe, are unhealthy. I've decided to stay as far away from the Catholic Church as I can. And I believe that I'm a healthy person for doing so. That being said, I don't belong to any organized religion at this point. The best way to describe myself, I guess, would be as an agnostic. A lot of people do feel that I am spiritual, or that there is some sort of spirituality about me. I've given a lot of speeches to Voice of the Faithful organizations. And their attitude is that they believe that although I may have turned my back on God, God has not turned his back on me. And that's a nice way to look at it. Yes, sir?
I'm curious that you mentioned your friend, the altar boy. Well, how did that impact his life? Do you have any follow-up on that?
He has remained underground all these years. He still lives back in my hometown. And you know, when I decided to go public, I wrote him a letter. And I explained to him why I was doing so, why I thought it was important. And I also assured him that I would, never reveal his identity or, drag him into this in any way if that was not what he wanted. And I never even got a response. I know he's married with kids living in my hometown. the other thing that I had found out just in the last year or so is that there were several other kids in my hometown that were molested by this priest at the same time that I wasn't aware of when I was a kid. But the current parish priest there said that he has provided counseling to 5 others. But you know, there was a period when I was pursuing the lawsuit where it would have been very helpful to me if I could have established a pattern, and at least if someone from my hometown was willing to go on record and say, yeah, the same thing happened to me. Or if it didn't happen, yeah, at least the priest made an attempt, put the moves on me. And nobody was willing to go on the record. And I think that part of it had to do with the fact, you know, this is, part of the problem is that this is really embarrassing stuff. No guy likes to admit having sex with, and I use the term having sex as opposed to being attacked by, no guy likes to admit a sexual encounter with another guy, especially if they're straight, especially if it's with a priest. And in my case, I had the additional problem of, well, I'll give you an example. Here it is. There was one guy who was molested by Father Holly. He was in my class, 6th and 7th grade. I didn't realize that he was a victim at the time in those years. But when my case was in the newspapers and stuff, this guy who was still living in my hometown went up to one of my older brothers and told the story in quite a bit of detail about what had happened to him. So my brother told me, and I related to my lawyer. My lawyer said, well, it'd be great if he would be willing to go on record, because we could show that you weren't the only one, that this priest had a pattern of behavior. So my lawyer called the guy, and the guy told the whole story. Happened, you know, a few times. And when my lawyer asked him if he'd be willing to give a deposition to support my allegations, the guy said, hell no, I don't want to do that. And my lawyer said, well, I don't understand. You just told me what happened. Why wouldn't you go on the record? We wouldn't necessarily have to use your name. And the guy said, well, I don't want to align myself with some faggots dying of AIDS. So there's a whole other level of stuff there that I had to contend with, but they would be, guilt by association. There's so many things that prevent people from speaking up. And believe me, the church has relied on those kinds of things. And it's worked very successfully up until a few years ago. Yes?
Maybe we're going to cover this later on in the conference, but I guess I just don't understand where the church's line is. I mean, say these priests were like killing little boys.
Yeah.
Would the bishop just like keep silent and move them to another parish and hope that didn't happen again and never alert them? You know what I mean? Where is that? I mean, why do they call it anonymously?
I think, the point that I really didn't make here is that these are crimes,
Yeah. I mean, they could call it anonymously even, I mean, I don't get it. When it's too much and all of a sudden they're fired.
Well, I think one element that's worth considering is that the Catholic Church does have a celibacy requirement. And I really believe that for many priests and bishops, that requirement is a very difficult lifestyle to live. And I think that if someone can be blackmailed, for example, and I'm not saying that this is definitely true, but it's something to think about. Suppose you have a bishop that is having a relationship with an adult woman, which is could be in many senses emotionally healthy, perhaps appropriate if she's, I don't know, maybe it's not appropriate, but in any case, If you're a bishop and you have something that you're trying to keep under wraps, and you hear that one of your priests is putting moves on a kid, you're going to be reluctant to turn in the priest if that priest can turn around and say something bad about you. And I think that what's happened with the Catholic Church is they have found that there's just this huge web of secrecy. And all the secrets, it seems, have to do with sex. And it's so unnecessary. But kids are getting hurt. But I do believe that that's part of it. That bishops haven't taken a stronger stand against these guys if they have some of their own secrets that they're trying to keep under wraps. I mean, we've got that case in Massachusetts now. A bishop is under grand jury investigation. He just resigned. He's about to be indicted for molesting children. This bishop of Springfield, Massachusetts. So, yes, sir. Look.
I'm not quite sure how to ask the question, but do you think that these priests that ultimately molest boys are able, since you ultimately found yourself to be gay,
Yeah.
do you think that these priests are able to see something in these young children? Because I think it's reasonably well accepted that a person can
Yeah, give me a minute here. So you respond now, thanks.
All right. Kind of excited not to respond here, but my son was molested, the doctor's word. My son was molested by my ex-husband. This has been 8 years now. So he was adopted at birth. So first of all, who's the mother, who's the father? He molested my son, who's in education. He later was asked to leave education for molesting my boy. What you stated, either the authority figure, and a father is an authority figure who has all the power, and or in his position as an educator, he was an authority figure. They looked for kids that were vulnerable and accessible. Just as many are heterosexual that might be homosexual. It is not whether they are or aren't. It's the opportunity to do it, and it's the power over that person for some reason. How many become homosexual or heterosexual? It may or may not affect it, in my opinion. But what I see is this tremendous guilt and weight, and it's very, very difficult, as he said, to speak out. But also in a family court setting, where the mothers or fathers who are trying to protect the child, the court system does exactly what the Catholic Church does, in my opinion. And family court keeps the secret because, in my opinion, they make a whole lot of money doing it because the protective parent keeps coming back to fight, fight, fight. What should have been, in my case, a $10,000 was $70,000. In the meantime, the child is constantly exposed, and if you're not careful, totally assigned to the perpetrator. Because if you don't play the game to a point, not only do you lose all your money, you lose your child. God, and I do believe in God desperately and fully, I don't have to be Catholic, because He put man in the desert for me, and I'm one of the very few to have my child at age 11. Because my child was bold and strong, and at that point could speak up. And what he was stating became so strong, they were fearful of him. So I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think it has anything at all to do with homosexuality or heterosexuality. It has to do with the opportunity, and that they're sexual addicts, in my opinion, who are going to get what they want, no matter who they hurt, they don't even consider it. And that's my opinion.
I think,
I was going to say, the sandwiches are going to be a little bit late, so we have till noon for questions still, so.
I think that part of your question you were wondering if the fact that I grew up to be gay, perhaps the priest perceived that perhaps I would be more receptive to his overtures. Is that what?
Yeah, I mean,
Well, okay, let me answer that.
To see in an 8 or
Listen.
11-year-old boy.
It's you know what, I think it's a fair question. I don't know what it was like when you were 11 or 12 years old, but I hadn't gone through puberty yet. This experience was absolutely repulsive to me. It amazes me, really, that I did grow up to be gay. Because I would have thought that, of course, who knows how these things work. I would have thought that if it was at all based on your childhood experiences, that it would have pushed me like way in the opposite direction.
In the other direction. Yeah.
So I think that certainly with pedophiles, which is strict, people that are hitting on prepubescent children, I don't think that it's really, it doesn't matter what the perp's orientation is or what the kid's going to grow up to be. Now it does get a little bit more complicated when you're talking about priests hitting on 15, 16, 17-year-old boys. And in that case, it is possible that a priest will perceive which kid might be curious or less likely to run away. It doesn't make it any less wrong, certainly.
Oh, I understand that. I was just wondering whether or not you felt like there was something there that they could that would lead them to believe when they're selecting their victims.
No. Yeah, but and the only other thing is that I know there are priests who specifically go after children who are otherwise vulnerable, who come from one-parent families or a family where the father is absent or drunk or whatever. In fact, Father Gagan very notoriously made that statement in one of his depositions, that he particularly liked going after kids that came from troubled families because they were much more appreciative of his affection. So, this one?
In comment to what you just spoke on, in 1989, I went to a law firm who specialized in insurance defense. And I recall transcribing a case where several boys had been molested by an authority figure. I don't recall the details, but they had attributed their homosexuality to these incidents of molestation.
Yeah. I personally don't buy it, but who am I to say? Yes.
Hi.
Thank you for being patient.
I really enjoyed hearing you speak about what you have gone through in your life. What I wonder is, are you aware of clergy outside of the Catholic Church itself actually condoning father perpetrators' actions after the children have reported to them what they've done? I have a 3-year-old and a 4.5-year-old reporting to 4 separate clergy, and the clergy have protected the father to the point where my children were taken from him. That's that's not the Catholic Church. These are, Protestant, different variations of the Protestant Church. I mean, they're like political. I don't understand it. I thought that they would be more protective and understanding.
I don't know.
Have you heard of anything like that before?
Now, the other thing that I've become aware of, it seems like there are a lot of problems in the Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, there was a news story about them just a few days ago. But that particular scenario, I haven't heard anything like that.
I don't think the Catholic Church has a corner on the market.
Well, no, but on the other hand, I don't know of any other faith-based organization that has institutionalized it to the degree that the Catholic Church has. That we know of, yeah.
Can you speak to the issue of what's going on in the church now? Are they recognizing anything about this, or are they still just going on things as usual?
Well, they've been brought kicking and screaming to the table. And, no, I think that there is a great deal more awareness that's going on now. But I don't think it's necessarily that the bishops are becoming more aware, because I believe the bishops have known all along. The awareness is on behalf of the parishioners, for one thing. And I think that to a much greater degree than in ever, in modern history, the bishops now are under a great deal of scrutiny, and they're getting it from the parishioners, they're getting it from civil authorities. And I think that, I hope and pray that in the last couple of years, there's been so much media attention to this issue, not only just in the Catholic Church, but child sexual abuse in general. I hope and pray that the young people of today will feel a little bit more empowered to get help if they're in a crisis situation. In years gone by, when people did call SNAP for the first time, we didn't hear from people until they were like in their 30s or their 40s. It took people that long to get to the point where they were willing to address what happened to them, realized that they were harmed or victimized, and wanted to try to seek some sort of restitution. In the last year, though, we're hearing from much younger people. We've heard from a number of people, in their 20s even, which was certainly not the case a couple of years ago. So,
I just wonder how you're supporting yourself or your program, because it's very costly going to court. It's costly to gather all this information. It's costly to get the publicity. It's great what you're doing, but you lose all your money and then you got to replace it. So how are you faring?
you talking about me personally or your organization? Or?
You and your organization.
Well, the way I'm supporting myself right now is I'm the webmaster for the national organization. And I would encourage you to check out our website sometime. It's www.snapnetwork.org. That's supported by funding. We are doing some fundraising. Voice of the Faithful has been very helpful to us. We have some survivors who were able to get settlements through lawsuits that have agreed to help support our efforts. But the thing is up until about a year and a half ago, SNAP was just run on a shoestring and a bunch of people who were doing it as volunteers. I mean, I worked for many years doing SNAP stuff for free. Yeah.
I was going to mention, after quite a few years, I went to speak to Monsignor Paul, who's the pastor at my church, about the issue of judges are handing sole custody to fathers that are sexually abusing their children under parental alienation syndrome. And this happened to my grandchildren. And anyway, the first thing he said to me, he said, why me? First thing. And then the second thing he said, now we're mandated reporters, so I have to know if this has been reported. But in any case, what I'm trying to say is that now they're mandated reporters, and I'm thinking everybody in the world is a mandated reporter, but priests were not.
Sure.
And now they are.
Sure. And boy, does that come back to haunt us in Massachusetts. Priests were never mandated reporters until about 18 months ago, even though the legislation was filed over and over and over again. But Cardinal Law would always rally his troops to vote against it. And in Massachusetts, most of the legislators are Catholic. Well, so finally we had a grand jury investigation, and the Attorney General found that there was not a single law that they could prosecute the Cardinal or any of his bishops, even though they had 240 child molesting priests that had, I don't know who knows what the final count of the number of victims over like 40 years. You have a huge And the most basic law, mandated reporting law, didn't even exist. And there are many states in this country where priests are still exempt from mandated reporting. But, you know, listen, people give them the power. That's it. We all have the right to vote. We all have a right to drop money in the collection basket or not drop the money in.
Except the courts are starting to take over and taking our rights away. Some of them are.
I want to give the young folks an opportunity to ask questions if anybody has any. No? Okay.
Well, I want to say something about the vulnerability of children, which is the question that you asked. There's a lot of discussion about kids being vulnerable to sexual abuse because they come from broken homes or whatever. That's not necessarily the primary thing that makes them vulnerable. I just attended a conference and they were talking about child molesters who had come forward and talked about how they got their victims. And one thing that was really interesting was the molester said, I would test the child by asking them to keep a secret that was a nothing secret. Like I put my shoes on the wrong feet or something like that. Some children are just very naturally compliant, and that makes them vulnerable. So if we have an idea that kids are vulnerable mainly because they come from broken homes or whatever, we're going to overlook kids that are just as vulnerable for other reasons. And that's really the molester's main way to get access to a child is their ability to determine whether the child will keep a secret. And that might be because they need attention they're not getting, but it might also be just because they happen to be a compliant child. And that's what makes them vulnerable, is the fact that the molester can recognize that they will be able to keep them silent.
Good point. Okay, man in the blue.
I'd like to address the subject of public awareness. I speak to service groups all over this country, and in fact in Canada too, and medical associations and a number of other places. But one of the things that I find wherever I go is that everybody says that these problems don't exist in my community. They're in your community, but they aren't in my community. And I often use the example that the exposure of the priests in the Catholic Church was both the best thing that could have happened to public awareness and the worst thing, because many of the people that I speak to, which are mostly all business leaders and professional people all over the country, state that we really don't have to worry about it. All we have to do is clean up the Catholic Church, because that's who's doing it all. And they don't have any idea that the actual number of cases involved with Catholic priests in terms of the overall total is minuscule. And so if you look at the public awareness is so far down.
I mean, minuscule in comparison with the number of cases in the general public.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And so, our whole Rotary program is about public awareness and education. But I think that there has to be really a very major effort to show that the sexual abuse of kids and child abuse and neglect in general is a major problem in every single community in this country, and in fact in the world.
You think it's getting better or worse?
It's hard to tell, because as the awareness becomes, as more and more people become aware, there are more and more reports. They used to say that there was, probably less than 10% of the actual cases were reported. Now that number, depending on whose study you read, is up to, they're probably getting 20% reported. So the numbers are increasing.
Yeah.
But it may be only because there's more reported. In California, 2 years ago, they listed 550,000 cases of child abuse and neglect reported, and that included sexual abuse. Last year, in 2002, last year, there were 704,000. So the reports are up, but nobody can tell whether or not that's because there's more awareness and people are finding out they can report it and they know how to do it, or whether or not the actual number of cases is up.
White shirt man.
Just curious, you brought up worldwide perspective because of the size of the Catholic Church. I'm just curious to know if there are international staff organizations and how this, is there any influence, what's the influence coming from all over the Catholic Church? And is it, it can't be isolated just because it's the United States. I just wondered, any international feel from your...
Well, I get very nervous when we talk about international cases because I've started getting some emails from Europe, and it's making me a little nervous. Only because I'm convinced that the problem is an international problem. Somebody explained to me that in Europe, or at least in France, I believe this reporter was telling me, they don't have the same sort of civil laws that we have in this country. So it's harder to get at the proof, get to the heart of the matter. And for that reason, it hasn't been exposed in the way it's been exposed in the States. And also the other thing is, you can say what you want about lawyers, good or bad. There was a financial incentive for people like Mitchell Garabedian and Eric McLeish, who was my lawyer. I mean, these are the two main guys in Boston that really put their careers on the line and worked for many years with very little to show for it, trying to get to the bottom of this and filing suit after suit, really pushing hard to get these records. And sure, there was a lot of altruism involved, but I think ultimately, if they didn't have hopes that there would be a financial payoff in the end, it probably wouldn't have happened. And we would probably still be sitting here in the dark. But I don't know that the same sort of thing could happen over in Europe. I do get emails from survivors. I've heard from people in Italy and France and Spain, and a lot in England. And there's an awful lot of cases in the Catholic Church in Ireland, in Austria, even in Australia. And I think that in Ireland there is a fairly well-known abuse survivors network there, but it's not a SNAP thing. At this point, SNAP is just based in the United States. There's been a lot of talk about me translating the website into Spanish, and I think that's a great idea, but who knows? The church is very powerful in Latin America, and my experience with Latin American Catholics is that it seems to me that they're even more trusting of their parish priests than we are, so who knows what that might unearth.
The incidence in Latin America is very high.
There's a couple books I'd like to recommend to you if you're interested in this. One is, they're both new books that have just come out since January. One is called Our Fathers. It's written by the former investigations editor at Newsweek magazine. His name is David France, F-R-A-N-C-E. And it covers a period of about 40 to 50 years in a series of vignettes, scenes that take place, and he arranges them chronologically through time. And I'm in there quite a bit of the book. And there's a lot of stuff about things that went on in the Vatican and so on. The other book is called Vows of Silence by Jason Barry, which focuses more specifically on the Vatican. It also tells the story of Father Thomas Doyle, who is one of the champions of victims going back in the 1980s. It was a co-author of a very rather, in our circle, a very famous document that was presented to all the Catholic bishops, warning them of this problem, the origins of the problem, things that they should do to prevent it from becoming a huge, prevent it from actually becoming what it has become in the Catholic Church, which is a huge crisis. So 2 books, Our Fathers and Vows of Silence, that I'd highly recommend. Jason Berry is Berry. Jason was a hero to me. He was an investigative reporter originally based in Louisiana, and he came out with a book, his first book in 1993 was called Lead Us Not Into Temptation, and it was the first really in-depth investigation into this problem in the Catholic Church. And for me, when I first got involved with this issue, his book was like a Bible to me. It taught me so much about what was going on behind the scenes. So.
One more question. Well, let's just say we're after 1, so we'll try just a little bit more.
Do you have a quicker route for us to get this exposed to the family court system? Any suggestions on that?
I can't. I don't have any experience in that area. But I'm sure there are lots of people here that do. No?
I just wanted to thank you and acknowledge you as a man for coming out as a survivor, because I think, women and girls have been talking about this stuff forever and no one gives a shit because, that's what happens to women and girls. But it has, I think, made a huge difference that a large number of males have come forth about this. And I wanted to acknowledge that and also ask about abuse within the Catholic Church of women and girls. Has that been a part of this, really?
Sure, it's a huge part. It doesn't seem to be, people don't seem to perceive it as being a big part, though. But I can tell you, at least in Boston, at our support group meetings, 40 to 50% of the people that show up are women. And I'm not sure why it is that they're not getting more publicity than they do. It could be perhaps that for whatever reason, some women just don't want to go public out of, I don't know, because they have kids and they don't want the kids to know that happened to them when they were young, or they're afraid that the kids will be pestered by their friends if it's revealed that their mother was a clean abuse victim. I'm not sure what it is. I can tell you that behind the scenes, the women are out there. They're coming to support group meetings. And, in Boston, we've gotten pretty politically active. We have a lot of rallies, a lot of opportunities to give public speeches on it. We just had a big rally at the State House a couple weeks ago. We had like 150 people. We marched from the cathedral to the State House, and a bunch of us gave speeches and stuff. And it seems like most of the speakers were women. So maybe Boston is an anomaly, I'm not sure. But your point about male survivors coming forward, that was sort of a new twist, a couple of years ago. And it was really, I remember hearing from a number of people, not survivors, but people in the general public who had never really, conceived of that being a possibility, that boys would be molested. So certainly we've educated a lot of people. But
Work you've done a lot.
yeah. Okay, great to be here.
Off the top of my head, one guess might be that it's just more scandalous to have the homosexual issue with it, sort of a double whammy, and they get more media mileage out of it. I don't know. Women are used to being exploited. We do have the sandwiches. And I did want to say, Mr. Saviano, thank your father and tell him that we're proud of him too for his finally coming around.
I will.
Amazing story, and your siblings for their support. The lunch is ready. We ask a $5 donation if possible. We have table up here for the Protective Parents Network. We have the quilting going on, and I guess we're still going to try to get back by, well, what would be 12 on that clock, 1 o'clock, if you can make it by that time. We'll see what our attendance is back at that time. Thank you. One note on the quilts, photographs of the quilts were on display from March 1st through 12th at the United Nations 48th session on the status of women.